It began with a scream swallowed by the night, the kind of sound that doesn't echo because it carries no strength left to bounce back. In the cold alley of a city that rarely cared for the invisible, a little girl curled against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were the only thing left to hold. Rainwater streamed down her thin clothes, her hair stuck to her cheeks, and her eyes, wide and unblinking, carried a silence more violent than any cry. Passers-by glanced and looked away, muttering excuses to themselves, while the world continued as if her suffering were just another piece of discarded trash on the pavement. But then the rhythm of heavy steps stopped. A tall man, his figure elegant but rigid, stood under the lamplight. His coat was expensive, his shoes untouched by mud, and his presence was out of place in that forgotten street. He looked at the child not with pity, but with a stunned recognition, as if the emptiness in her gaze had mirrored something buried inside his own chest for too long. He was a man of means, of power, of decisions that made others bow their heads. Yet in that moment his wealth became useless against the small, trembling frame before him. The stories about him often spoke of coldness, of a life built on iron discipline, and on a marriage that had dissolved under the weight of infertility, leaving him rich but barren of heirs, respected but untouched by intimacy. No one expected him to bend, let alone to kneel, but he did, lowering himself until his eyes met hers. For the first time in years, his voice cracked when he asked a question so simple, it sounded like a prayer. "Do you want to come with me?" The girl did not nod, nor speak, but the faintest flicker of life in her gaze answered for her. He lifted her gently against the judgment of the night and walked away with her in his arms. What neither of them knew was that this encounter was not rescue alone. It was the beginning of a collision that would reshape both of their destinies forever. The rain had ended by dawn, leaving behind the city washed yet unchanged, a place that never truly remembered the tears it had caused. In an apartment that towered over the gray skyline, the man sat in silence, the child asleep in the next room, her breathing shallow but steady, as if her body had never trusted rest before. He stared at the window, at the faint trails of water sliding down the glass, and his reflection seemed to accuse him with a question he could not answer. Why had he stopped for her when he had ignored so many others? For years he had trained himself to walk past suffering with indifference, to believe that his money and position were fortresses against the chaos of the streets. He had convinced himself that sterility meant fate had spoken, and there was no space for children in his legacy, only numbers, contracts, and properties that outlived their owners. Yet the sight of that girl, drenched and abandoned, had cracked the mask he wore so carefully. She had not pleaded, had not begged, had not even extended a hand, but something in the hollow of her stare had undone the steel that bound his life. It was as though she had reached into the part of him most guarded and called him out, not with words, but with the unspoken truth that he had always feared, that all the wealth in the world could not fill the silence of an empty home. He remembered the years when he and his wife had tried, the rituals of medical appointments, the false hopes, the cruel statistics delivered in sterile rooms by doctors who spoke of life like it was a transaction. He remembered the bitterness that grew between them, how love turned into distance, and how distance turned into separation. He had not remarried, had not sought companionship again, because something inside him had calcified, convinced that he was not meant to nurture, not meant to pass anything down except material possessions. But the girl's presence, fragile and almost spectral, had unsettled the grave he had dug within himself. Her story unfolded in fragments, told not through words but through the scars of her silence. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice trembled like glass about to break. What he learned came from official reports he demanded after the sleepless night when he first brought her home, papers that documented neglect as if it were routine, the kind of file that social workers stamped and moved along like any other. Her parents had been absent long before they were gone, swallowed by substances and debts, leaving her to fend for herself long before her small body could handle the weight of hunger and cold. She had survived in the shadows, a ghost child that no one saw unless she became inconvenient, until the night when fate placed her in his path. Reading the file, he felt an anger he could not easily place, for it was not only anger at the strangers who had failed her, but at himself too. For all the times he had walked past children like her without turning his head. He wondered if this was redemption, knocking on his door, or punishment for a lifetime of calculated indifference. The girl, however, did not look at him like a savior, nor like an enemy. Her gaze was something else entirely. Cautious, searching, unwilling to give trust, yet unwilling to flee either. It was as if she knew that what had begun between them was not charity, but something far more dangerous, something that could alter both their destinies irreversibly. In the days that followed, he adjusted his routines in ways that startled even him. The man who had lived by schedules and meetings now woke at odd hours to check if the girl was sleeping, if she had eaten, if she was warm enough. The silence of his apartment, once a comfort, now felt oppressive when she wasn't in the room. He found himself learning the language of her quiet gestures, the way she hesitated before touching food, as if afraid it would be snatched away, the way she froze at sudden noises, the way she slept curled tight as though expecting to be shaken awake. He bought clothes, books, toys, but discovered that her gratitude was muted, almost painful, for she received them with suspicion, as though gifts were weapons that carried hidden costs. Still, he persisted, not because he sought her thanks, but because he felt something unfamiliar stirring in him each time he saw her take a step closer to trust. At night, lying awake, he confronted memories he had buried. The emptiness of hospital corridors, the sterile words of doctors, the long silence after his wife had finally left. He realized that in saving the girl, he was also being dragged back into the confrontation with his own infertility, forced to face the question he had avoided for decades. Could he still be a father, even without blood to bind them? The thought terrified him, for it was easier to remain cold than to risk warmth and lose it again. The outside world, however, did not stand still. Whispers began to circulate among his circle, questions about why a man of his stature would suddenly bring a child into his home. His relatives, distant but watchful, made calls laced with suspicion, suggesting motives that reduced his act to scandal or folly. The newspapers, always eager for a story, speculated about the mystery child seen entering his building, painting him as eccentric, unstable, or attempting some elaborate public gesture to compensate for his isolation. He read the articles with disgust, but beneath his anger was a quiet fear. What if society's poison seeped into her world once again? He wanted to shield her from every gaze, every judgment, but he knew it was impossible. He had lived long enough to understand that money could silence some voices, but never all of them, and sometimes it only amplified the whispers. Yet when he returned home each evening, and the girl was there, waiting not with joy but with the simple fact of presence, he felt the outside world lose its weight. It was inside those walls, in the fragile exchange of glances and half-formed words, that he began to sense the possibility of building something neither of them had ever dared to imagine: a family without the permission of blood. She too observed him with eyes that saw deeper than he wanted. The girl did not speak of her past much, but her silences were eloquent. She noticed the way he lingered over old photographs, hidden in drawers he rarely opened, pictures of a woman whose smile was now only a memory. She saw the fatigue that cloaked him when he returned from meetings, his shoulders heavy, his eyes shadowed by battles fought in boardrooms that no child could name. She sensed the loneliness that clung to him, different from her own yet somehow familiar, as if both of them carried invisible chains forged in different fires, but leading to the same isolation. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she studied him with a mixture of caution and longing, as if trying to decide whether this man, with his wealth and his walls, could be trusted to hold her fragile world without breaking it further. It was in those moments that something unspoken formed between them, a thread too delicate to be called love, yet too strong to be dismissed as circumstance. The house began to change. Where once silence reigned, now there were traces of another life. The sound of smaller footsteps across the marble floors, the presence of toys on the couch, the faint echo of a child's breathing in the rooms at night. He noticed how even the staff walked differently, softer, more careful, as though the presence of the girl demanded reverence. The girl herself moved like a shadow still, cautious and small, but each day her movements grew less hesitant. She dared to open cupboards, to sit in the armchair by the window, to place a book on the table as if claiming space. He did not announce it, but he watched, and with each gesture, he felt a quiet swelling inside him, an ache that was equal parts pain and joy. He realized that he was not only offering her shelter, she was reshaping the house, breaking the sterility that had defined it for so long. For the first time in years, he found himself arriving home not to emptiness, but to expectation, fragile and wordless, yet undeniable. Yet the ghosts of the past did not leave easily. He found himself haunted by doubts at night. What if he failed her? What if he became another figure who abandoned her, leaving scars deeper than the ones she already carried? He wrestled with the memory of his wife's final words, bitter and sharp, when she had told him that he would never know what it meant to be a father. He had accepted it as truth then, had carried it like a sentence written in stone. But now, looking at the girl asleep in the room across from his, he wondered if fate had lied, if fatherhood was not bound by blood but by the willingness to stay, to endure, to carry the weight of another life even when it was inconvenient. The thought both terrified and freed him. He had spent decades building walls against vulnerability, yet here was a child who, without trying, had begun to dismantle them brick by brick. One evening, he found her sitting by the window, her knees drawn to her chest, watching the city lights. He asked her what she saw, and for the first time she answered without hesitation. People who belong somewhere. The words cut through him like a blade, for they carried both longing and resignation. He sat beside her, unsure how to respond, and finally said, "Maybe we can belong somewhere together." She did not answer, but her head rested lightly against his arm, a gesture so small yet so monumental that it stayed with him for nights afterward. It was in that fragile moment that he realized belonging was not granted by others, not certified by society, but created in the quiet courage of two people daring to claim each other. And so, the seed of a new life began to take root, not through grand declarations, but through the quiet accumulation of shared moments. A meal eaten side by side, a laugh that escaped unexpectedly, a silence that felt less heavy. Each day they wrote an unspoken pact that said neither would turn away, that both, scarred and incomplete, could become whole by choosing to remain. The city outside might not understand, might even resist, but inside those walls something undeniable was happening. A man once barren of heirs and a girl once stripped of family were finding each other in the ruins of their solitude, and though the path ahead would demand more than either of them yet knew, they had already stepped onto it together, and it was only the beginning. The storm arrived not with thunder in the sky, but with voices on the phone, voices sharpened by judgment and suspicion. The man who had once been untouchable in his circles now found himself questioned at every turn. Business partners asked him why he was distracting himself with unnecessary complications. Relatives hinted at impropriety, and even the lawyers who managed his estate advised caution, reminding him of the delicate balance of his public image. To them, the girl was a disruption, a liability, an unknown variable in a world that thrived on control and predictability. He listened, his jaw set, his replies clipped, but inside, anger seethed, not only at their arrogance, but at the way they reduced her existence to a threat. She was not a calculation. She was a child, and he had seen what abandonment had already carved into her small body. To walk away now would be to confirm every cruelty that had shaped her. And yet the pressure was relentless. The kind of pressure he had wielded himself in boardrooms now turned back on him with the weight of social expectation. For the first time in years, he found himself on the defensive, not in business, but in life, fighting for something fragile and profoundly human. The orphan, unaware of the storms brewing in whispered conversations and shadowed meetings, continued her slow transformation in his home, her trust inching forward like a timid dawn. And it was precisely this contrast, the innocence of her small steps against the roar of external judgment, that made him realize the scale of the battle he had entered. It was during a dinner with extended family that the conflict first erupted in the open, no longer hidden behind polite inquiries or thinly veiled insinuations. The table was long, adorned with silver and crystal, but the atmosphere was sharp as glass. They spoke of tradition, of lineage, of the importance of bloodlines, their words dressed as concern, but heavy with disdain. One cousin asked, with a smile that cut, if he intended to play father to strays now. Another suggested that his loneliness had clouded his judgment, that perhaps he was compensating for failures he refused to acknowledge. He sat there, the girl absent but present in every barb, his hand tightening around the stem of his glass until he feared it would shatter. For years he had endured these gatherings with stoic indifference, but this time the attack was not on him alone. It was on her, and that he could not bear. He rose before the meal was finished, his chair scraping against the floor, his words cold and final. He would not explain himself to those who measured worth only by inheritance. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief, for he had never defied them so openly before. Walking away from that table, he knew a line had been drawn, and there would be no return to the fragile peace of polite distance. The girl, however, sensed the change without needing to be told. Children who survive abandonment develop instincts sharper than words, and she felt the tension in the air like an approaching storm. She asked him one night, her voice thin and uncertain, if he was angry because of her. The question pierced him deeper than any insult his relatives had thrown, for it revealed her fear of being the cause of yet another rejection. He knelt beside her bed, choosing his words with a care he had rarely given to anyone. He told her that the anger was not at her, but at those who could not see her worth. He promised, not with dramatic vows but with quiet certainty, that he would not leave. She listened, her eyes searching his face as if weighing the truth of his words against the catalogue of broken promises she had known. At last she nodded, and though the gesture was small, it carried the weight of fragile belief. In that moment he understood that the true battle was not with society or with his relatives, but with the scars of doubt etched into her heart. Still, the outside pressures grew, not only from family but from officials who seemed more concerned with paperwork than with lives. Investigations were launched, questions asked about his suitability as a guardian, his past scrutinized with clinical detachment. His wealth, once a shield, now made him a target, for the public eye loved nothing more than a story of a rich man entangled in scandal. He endured interviews, inspections, endless forms, all while watching the girl retreat into herself, each time a stranger entered the house with a clipboard and a smile too rehearsed. She did not understand the language of bureaucracy, but she understood intrusion, and it reopened old wounds of being examined, categorized, and dismissed. He felt his fury rise at the way her humanity was reduced to a checklist, her future balanced on signatures and stamps. He had fought governments and corporations before, but never had he felt such urgency. For this was not about profit or power. It was about the fragile trust of a child who had dared to believe in him. As the weeks dragged on, he found himself speaking words he had never imagined uttering in front of others. In hearings and meetings, he declared his intent not as a transaction, but as a vow, his voice stripped of the polish of a businessman and filled instead with raw conviction. He spoke of her resilience, of the small victories she had made in their home, of the way she had begun to smile when she thought no one was watching. His words, uncharacteristically emotional, unsettled those who expected him to be cold and detached. Some scoffed, others remained unmoved, but a few began to see not a scandal, but a story of redemption. Yet even as he spoke, he knew the battle was far from over. Power resists change, and the machinery of law and family was grinding against him, threatening to crush what they had begun to build. The girl, meanwhile, was caught in her own struggle. She wanted to trust, to believe that this man would not vanish as others had. But trust was not a switch to be flipped. It was a fragile flame that needed shelter from every gust of doubt. She tested him in small ways, asking questions about whether he would be there tomorrow, leaving drawings on his desk to see if he noticed, withdrawing into silence to see if he pursued her. Each test was a map of her fears, and each time he responded with patience, with presence, with the quiet insistence that he was not leaving. Slowly, the tests grew fewer, and the silences less heavy, but the battle inside her was far from won. She carried the weight of abandonment in her bones, and though she had begun to lean toward him, she knew how quickly the ground could give way. It was during one of these fragile evenings that the incident occurred, which would mark the true beginning of their shared conflict. A rumor surfaced in the press, fueled by a rival in business who sought to undermine him. The story painted him as unstable, accused him of exploiting the girl for sympathy, suggested that his actions were a desperate attempt to distract from failures. The article was cruel, filled with innuendo, and it spread quickly. He read it in silence, but when the girl saw the headline, her small face next to words she could not fully understand but sensed were cruel, her eyes filled with a fear he had not seen since the night he found her. She asked if they would take her away. His hands trembled as he pulled her close, assuring her that she was not going anywhere. But inside, the fury roared. The battle was no longer abstract. It was personal, public, and merciless. From that night on, he knew there was no room for half measures. The conflict had escalated beyond whispers and paperwork. It had become a test of endurance, of loyalty, of whether he could protect her not only from hunger and cold, but from the machinery of a world that resented anything that did not fit its order. The incident incited in him a resolve that surprised even himself. He would not bend. He would not let her be dragged back into the void from which she had barely escaped. The fight would be long, brutal, and costly. But he understood now that it was not a question of choice. It was destiny, and they were bound to face it together. And as he watched her sleep that night, curled beneath blankets that finally held warmth instead of dampness, he realized that the battle ahead was not only about guardianship or family. It was about proving, to the world and to themselves, that two broken souls could defy the order of things and create something whole. The incident that had shaken their fragile peace was only the beginning of the storm, and he felt the first true stirrings of purpose he had known in years. For the first time, he was not merely surviving his own emptiness. He was fighting for a future that belonged not only to him, but to them both. The days that followed the scandal were not calm but fevered, charged with a tension that seemed to seep into every corner of their lives. The girl began school under his name, entering through the grand gates of an institution that had long served as a proving ground for the children of the elite. Her small figure stood out immediately among polished uniforms and whispered pedigrees. She carried no family crest, no legacy, only the shadow of her past and the protection of his name. But protection was not armor, and whispers moved quickly in places where privilege thrived. Children repeated what they heard at home. Cruel fragments of adult conversations stripped of context, but sharpened by innocence into weapons. They called her names, asked questions about her real parents, laughed at her silence. He watched from a distance, his heart tightening each time she returned home quieter than she had left. Yet she endured, and in her endurance, he saw a reflection of his own battles, the stubbornness that refused to yield even when the odds were stacked against him. Still he feared the wounds that words could carve, wounds less visible but no less deep than hunger or cold. He confronted teachers, demanded protection, threatened withdrawal, but he knew the fight could not shield her from every cruelty. She was learning what it meant to exist in a world that measured worth by blood, and the lesson was bitter. Inside the house, change moved like a tide that could not be reversed. The girl began to claim space in ways both subtle and bold. She drew pictures and taped them to walls once bare of anything but expensive art. Her crude crayons jarring against gilded frames yet somehow more alive. She left toys scattered across carpets where once only silence lay. She asked questions at dinner, small at first, then bolder, challenging his routines and his silences. For a man who had lived in control of every detail, it was both unsettling and liberating. He found himself laughing, a sound so foreign it startled the staff, who glanced at each other with astonishment. Yet even as warmth began to seep in, doubt gnawed at him. Could he truly give her what she needed? Could he be more than shelter, More than food and books and a name to protect her from the world's disdain? Fatherhood, he was learning, was not a title granted by documents, nor erased by biology. It was the daily act of choosing another life over one's own comfort. Each choice bound him closer to her, but each choice also made the stakes of failure heavier. He had lived through financial ruin, betrayal in business, the loss of marriage, but the thought of failing this child filled him with a fear unlike any he had known. Obstacles appeared in places he had not expected. Business rivals, sensing his distraction, pressed harder in negotiations, exploiting every moment his focus faltered. Shareholders questioned his decisions, accusing him of reckless sentimentality. Old allies turned cautious, reluctant to align with a man who seemed to be challenging not only corporate order, but social tradition. He weathered these storms with the same skill that had built his empire, but the cost was different now. Every meeting meant time away from her. Every conflict drained energy he wanted to spend in her presence. He discovered that the battle was not simply between him and the world, but between the demands of his past identity and the fragile construction of his new one. He could no longer be only the ruthless businessman. He had to be something softer, something stronger, something he was still learning to become. The duality threatened to break him, but it also forged him, hammering away the excess until he stood rawer, truer, stripped of pretense. For the girl, adaptation was equally brutal. School became a battleground, not of fists but of whispers and exclusion. She learned to defend herself not with violence, but with silence, her quiet defiance confusing those who expected tears. Yet each act of endurance took its toll. At night she sometimes wept softly, thinking he did not hear. But he did. He stood outside her door, listening, his hand hovering over the handle, torn between entering to comfort her and respecting the fragile dignity she clung to. Sometimes he entered, and she let him sit beside her in silence, the presence itself enough. Other times he stayed outside, his own chest aching with helplessness. These moments taught him humility. He could not erase her past, nor shield her from every wound. All he could do was remain, again and again, so that the one truth she learned was that he would not abandon her. Resistance also grew sharper within his family. The more he stood firm, the more desperate their attempts became to undermine him. A lawsuit was threatened, couched in the language of concern, arguing that his guardianship was reckless, that his wealth was being used irresponsibly. They spoke of heritage, of protecting the estate from dilution, but beneath the words was naked disdain for a child who did not belong by their measures. He fought them in courtrooms as he had fought rivals in boardrooms, his lawyers armed with evidence, his voice steady with conviction. Yet the battles drained him, and though he emerged victorious in rulings, he returned home each time more weary. She sensed it, and in her quiet way, she tried to give back what little she had. She drew pictures of them together, crude sketches of a man and a girl holding hands beneath a house, and left them on his desk. He kept everyone tucked away like treasures, reminders of why the battles mattered. The greatest obstacle, however, was not external, but internal. The man who had once lived in solitude now wrestled with vulnerability that left him exposed in ways money could not protect. He feared not only failure but love itself, the terrifying vastness of it, the way it demanded everything without guarantee of return. He had built his empire on certainty, on contracts and clauses that bound people to their word. But this fragile bond with a child who had no obligation to stay, no reason to forgive if he failed, was bound by nothing but choice. And choice, he knew, could shift, could falter. He woke some nights in a sweat, haunted by the possibility that she might one day look at him with the same disappointment his wife had once carried, the same finality of someone who had judged him unworthy. Yet each morning, when she sat across from him at breakfast, her small hands holding a cup too large for her frame, the fear receded, replaced by the quiet determination to try again, to choose again, to remain again. Their world was not without its small victories. She began to smile more openly, to laugh without covering her mouth, to run through the halls of the house as if testing the echo of her own joy. He began to relax into these moments, allowing himself to enjoy the present without constantly fearing the collapse of the future. Together they carved routines, evening walks, shared books, quiet meals where silence was no longer heavy but companionable. Yet even in these moments of peace, shadows lingered, for each joy was tempered by the knowledge that outside forces waited, watching, ready to strike. They lived in a fragile balance, building something precious in the eye of the storm, knowing that storms do not rest forever. The escalation of tension reached a new peak when an anonymous letter arrived, slipped under his door, filled with venomous words that accused him of sins he had not committed. It spoke of impropriety, of corruption, of exploitation, and though unsigned, its intent was clear: to destroy both his reputation and her fragile place in his world. He burned the letter after reading it, but the words lingered like smoke in his lungs. The girl saw the strain in his eyes, asked him if he was ill. He shook his head, forcing a smile, but inside, he felt the war tightening around them. He understood then that this was not a temporary struggle but a war of endurance, one that would demand everything from him. His name, his power, his patience, his heart. And so, they faced each day with the knowledge that the world would not relent. Each obstacle carved at them, yet each obstacle also bound them closer, for in the crucible of resistance, their bond grew stronger, sharper, more unyielding. He began to see the truth with clarity. They were no longer two broken lives colliding by chance. They were a family being forged in fire, tested by every force that sought to break them. And though the battles left scars, those scars became proof that they had endured. It was not peace they lived in, but persistence. And persistence, he realized, was its own form of love. The day of reckoning did not announce itself with warning, but unfolded with a suddenness that left both of them unsteady. It began with a letter from the authorities, formal and cold, declaring that her custody was under review due to concerns raised by third parties. He read it at the long dining table, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, though his face betrayed no emotion. She sat across from him, chewing a piece of bread, unaware at first, until she saw the color drain from his expression. He folded the letter neatly, placed it down as though it were any other correspondence, but inside, a storm tore through him. He had fought battles before, corporate wars, legal disputes, betrayals that would have crushed lesser men, but never had he felt such primal fear. To lose her now, not because of his own failing but because of the malice of others, was a possibility he could not bear. That night, after she had gone to bed, he walked the length of the house again and again, his footsteps echoing off marble floors that no longer felt like wealth but like prison bars. For the first time, the empire he had built seemed meaningless, each stone a monument to solitude, unless she remained within it. He understood then that this was the moment that would define not only his future, but hers. Either he would defy the system and protect her, or he would watch her vanish into it, consumed as so many forgotten children were. The hearing was scheduled swiftly, bureaucracy moving with uncharacteristic speed when stirred by scandal. The courtroom was sterile, high-ceilinged, filled with the murmur of voices that carried judgment before a word had been spoken. He entered with her hand in his, her small fingers gripping tightly, her eyes wide not with curiosity but with dread. She had been in rooms like this before, with people deciding her fate without asking her what she wanted, and the ghosts of those memories clung to her now. He felt her trembling and wished he could carry the weight of her fear, but all he could do was remain beside her, unflinching. The judge looked down from the bench with practiced detachment, flanked by officials who shuffled papers and whispered among themselves. Opposite him sat his relatives, faces stern, their voices ready with arguments polished to appear reasonable. They spoke of stability, of propriety, of legacy, painting him as impulsive, reckless, unfit to guide a child's future. They wrapped their disdain in silk, but he heard the venom beneath it. Each word was a strike, not only at him but at her, reducing her once again to a pawn in their endless pursuit of power and order. He listened, fists clenched, waiting for his moment to speak, knowing that this was not merely a battle of logic but a war of endurance, and that every word mattered. When his turn came, He rose with a steadiness that belied the fire inside him. He spoke not as a businessman, not as the architect of empires, but as a man stripped bare by the necessity of love. His voice was calm, yet each syllable carried weight, a resonance that filled the chamber. He spoke of her past, not in detail that would wound her further, but in acknowledgment of the pain she had endured and the resilience she carried. He spoke of the nights he had stayed awake listening to her quiet breathing, of the mornings when she dared to smile, of the drawings she left on his desk that became more valuable to him than any contract or asset. He declared that family was not blood alone, that fatherhood was not written in genes but in choices repeated daily, choices to remain when others fled. He did not plead. He did not beg. He simply told the truth with a conviction that made silence fall heavy across the courtroom. She watched him, her eyes wide, for it was the first time she had seen him not as unshakable, but as human, vulnerable, risking everything with words spoken in her defense. The climax came not in his speech but in the moment she herself rose, unprompted, and stood before the court. The room held its breath as this small figure, frail yet unyielding, lifted her voice. It was not eloquence that carried her but honesty, words broken yet sharp as glass. She said she had been left before, many times, by people who promised and vanished, and that this man had not promised much but had stayed. She said she did not need more toys, or more food, or a bigger house. What she needed was someone who would not disappear. Her voice cracked, but she stood firm, her small fists clenched at her sides. The judge leaned forward, the murmurs ceased, and for the first time the scales seemed to tilt. The truth, spoken by a child who had lived abandonment, pierced through the polished arguments of adults who had never known such hunger. In that moment, the battle shifted, not by law alone but by the undeniable force of raw humanity. But victory was never simple. Even as the judge postponed a ruling demanding further review, the machinery of resistance moved. Reporters swarmed, headlines screamed, and his rivals doubled their attacks, sensing that his heart had become his weakness. Business deals faltered, allies withdrew, and the empire trembled under the weight of personal war. He stood firm, but inside, exhaustion gnawed at him, the kind that no sleep could cure. He had spent his life controlling outcomes, bending circumstances to his will. But here he faced forces that thrived on chaos, on the unpredictability of human cruelty. Each day brought new accusations, each night brought new doubts, and yet each morning, when she came to breakfast and sat across from him with cautious trust, he found reason to rise again. It was not strategy that kept him moving now, but something deeper, older, something primal. The refusal to surrender a child to the void. The breaking point came when his health faltered, not with dramatic collapse but with the slow erosion of strength. Sleepless nights, endless battles, unrelenting stress. His body began to betray him. She noticed before anyone else, saw the shadows under his eyes, the way he rubbed his temples as though holding back pain. One evening, she placed a glass of water before him and said softly, "You don't have to fight alone." The words struck him harder than any blow, for they revealed not weakness but the bond they had built. She saw his struggle not as a burden but as shared weight, something they carried together. In her voice, he heard the echo of his own unspoken fears, and in her presence, he found strength renewed. He realized then that the battle was no longer his alone, but theirs, and that this truth was the turning point of everything. The climax surged in a confrontation with his closest rival, a man who had orchestrated much of the venom against him. It happened in public, at a gathering meant to celebrate achievements in business, but which became the stage for private war. The rival spoke with mockery thinly veiled as jest, insinuating that he had lost his edge, that sentiment had made him weak. For years, he might have responded with cold disdain, but now he stepped forward, his voice carrying not corporate arrogance, but personal conviction. He declared, in front of those who had whispered and doubted, that he would not apologize for love, that strength was not measured by profit alone, but by the willingness to protect those who could not protect themselves. The room stilled, for his words shattered the unspoken rules of their world. The rival sneered, But the audience shifted, unease rippling through the ranks of those who had once followed blindly. A seed had been planted, a crack in the facade of power, and though the rivals still plotted, the tide had begun to turn. For the girl, the climax was lived not in words or declarations, but in the realization that she was no longer alone. She saw him fight battles that endangered his empire, risk ridicule, endure exhaustion, all for her. She began to believe not in promises but in patterns, in the simple truth that he remained again and again. And in that belief, she transformed too. She no longer walked with eyes cast down but began to meet gazes, to speak when questioned, to laugh openly. The world still whispered, still doubted, but inside the fortress they were building, she began to heal. Her healing, fragile and incomplete, was itself a defiance, a victory carved from the jaws of loss. And so, the climax was not a single moment but a convergence of many. His speech in court, her words before the judge, his confrontation with rivals, her slow rebirth into trust. Together these moments wove a tapestry of defiance, a declaration that destiny could be rewritten not by power or blood, but by persistence and love. They emerged from this storm not unscarred but unbroken, standing on the edge of a new horizon. Yet even as relief brushed their shoulders, a shadow lingered. The war was not over, the system not yet silenced, the future still uncertain. But for the first time, they stood together not as savior and orphan, not as benefactor and ward, but as father and daughter in all but name. And that bond, forged in fire, was the true turning point, the climax that would echo through every battle yet to come. The weeks after the courtroom confrontation unfolded like an endless twilight, neither full day nor night, a limbo where victory and defeat lived side by side in the same breath. He returned home each evening with the weight of battles still unfinished, and she greeted him with cautious eyes that searched his face for answers he could not yet give. The rulings had not been finalized. Investigations dragged on, the machinery of bureaucracy grinding slowly as though determined to test his endurance. Yet within the waiting, something profound began to shift. The house, once sterile and echoing, now carried a rhythm that no judge or official could undo. They lived together not in certainty, but in persistence, and persistence itself became a kind of triumph. She began to leave her books open on the table, her drawings pinned not only in her room but in the hallways, her shoes left by the door without apology. Each act was small, almost invisible, yet together they formed a declaration. She was no longer a guest. She belonged, and in this quiet belonging, he felt his own transformation deepen. For the first time in years, he no longer measured his days by contracts or profits, but by the sound of her voice, the echo of her footsteps, the fragile trust that grew each time she looked at him without fear. The transformation, however, was not a simple ascent. With each step toward closeness, he confronted ghosts that had long stalked him in silence. He found himself remembering the sterile smell of hospitals, the way doctors had spoken of his infertility as though it were a simple fact, a biological footnote, while for him it had been the unspoken tombstone of an entire future. He remembered his wife's silence after each appointment, her gaze turning colder with every failed attempt, until their marriage itself collapsed under the weight of emptiness. For years he had buried those memories under layers of wealth and power, convincing himself that fatherhood was a door permanently closed. Now, as he tucked the girl into bed, as he listened to her steady breathing in the night, he realized that the door had never been locked. It had only demanded a different key. Yet even this realization carried pain, for it forced him to confront the years lost, the choices that had driven love away, the mistakes that had calcified into loneliness. Transformation required excavation, and as he built a new life with her, he also unearthed every bone of his past, holding it to the light, trembling as he admitted that the man he had been was not enough, but the man he was becoming might yet be worthy. For the girl, transformation was equally jagged, filled with steps forward and backward, trust gained and lost in fragile cycles. She began to speak more freely, telling stories of her past in fragments that broke his heart. She spoke of nights spent hiding from shouting voices, of mornings without food, of the way promises had always been made in tones that carried emptiness beneath them. She revealed scars invisible to the eye, the kind that linger in the way a child hesitates before touching joy, unsure if it will be snatched away. Listening to her, he felt rage surge within him, a fury not at her but at the cruelty of a world that had allowed her suffering. Yet he knew that anger could not heal, only patience could. And so he listened without interruption, without promises he could not keep, offering instead the steady presence of a man who would not turn away. Each confession was a test, and each time he remained, she edged closer to trust. Slowly she began to laugh more easily, to run without fear, to speak of tomorrow without dread. Her transformation was not the erasure of pain, but the courage to live despite it. And in that courage, he found lessons he had never learned from boardrooms or empires. The outside world, relentless as ever, continued its assaults, but something had shifted inside him. Where once he had fought to protect his empire, now he fought only to protect her. And this clarity gave him a strength no rival could erode. He faced scandals with unflinching resolve, endured the whispers of high society with indifference, and redirected his wealth not toward expansion, but toward fortification. He sold shares, restructured companies, delegated power, also that his presence at home remained constant. Associates shook their heads, declaring him a man diminished, but he knew the truth. He was not diminished, but transformed. And transformation always looks like ruin to those who cannot understand it. The girl noticed, too. She saw him at home more often, saw the way he lingered over dinner conversations, the way he asked about her day with genuine attention. She realized that he was not only fighting for her in courts and offices, but in the simple act of remaining, of being present, of refusing to vanish. And this realization became her anchor, the evidence she had needed that love was not a promise of tomorrow, but a choice made today, repeated again and again until it became truth. Yet transformation carries its cost, and the cost was heavy. His health, already strained, demanded reckoning. Nights of restless sleep, days of relentless conflict, years of buried grief. They accumulated like stones on his chest. He collapsed once, not in public but in the privacy of his home, the girl finding him slumped in a chair, his breath shallow. Panic flooded her, a terror that he too might disappear like so many before. But he survived, waking to her tear-streaked face hovering over him, her small hand clutching his. The doctor who visited scolded him for overwork, warned of consequences if he did not slow down. And for the first time, he listened. He realized that transformation was not only about endurance, but about sustainability, about building a life not out of constant battles, but out of rhythms that allowed healing. He began to delegate more, to rest when needed, to walk with her in gardens instead of burying himself in endless documents. It was a quiet revolution, one that shifted not only his health but their relationship, teaching both of them that strength was not the absence of weakness, but the courage to continue despite it. The girl, too, carried costs. Trusting meant opening herself to pain again, and sometimes the old fears surged back like storms that refused to fade. A slammed door, a raised voice, even from strangers, could send her spiraling into silence. At school, though she had gained friends, she still faced moments of cruelty that reopened wounds. She would return home some days withdrawn, her eyes shadowed, and he would sit with her until she was ready to speak. He did not press, did not demand explanations, for he knew that healing could not be forced. Instead, he offered the same gift she had given him, presence. And slowly, she began to find resilience, to realize that fear did not mean abandonment, that silence did not mean rejection, that even in storms, some people remained. Her transformation was not a straight path, but a spiral, circling back on old wounds, yet climbing toward light, and in each circle he walked beside her, refusing to let her face it alone. Together, they began to create rituals, small anchors that tethered them to each other amidst the chaos. They read books together in the evenings, shared meals cooked not by staff, but by their own hands fumbling in the kitchen, planted flowers in the garden, and watched them grow. These rituals, simple and unremarkable to outsiders, became sacred to them. They were not symbols of wealth or power, but of permanence, proof that they were building something that could not be measured in contracts or ruled upon in courts. Each ritual was a statement of belonging, a quiet vow that they would continue to choose each other day after day. And as these rituals accumulated, they both realized that they no longer lived in the shadow of what had been taken from them, but in the light of what they were creating together. But even in this transformation, shadows lingered. The final ruling on her custody still loomed, and though signs pointed in his favor, the uncertainty gnawed at them both. He feared that all they had built could still be undone by the stroke of a pen, that the fragile sanctuary they had created could be shattered. She feared it too, though she spoke of it rarely, her fears surfacing only in nightmares that woke her trembling. He comforted her as best he could, holding her until she slept again, whispering truths he could not yet prove, that he would never let her go. And though the future remained uncertain, they both clung to the present, to the rituals, to the daily persistence of love. It was in these acts that they found strength, not in the guarantees of law, but in the unyielding choice to remain. And so, transformation came not as a sudden blaze, but as a slow fire that burned away the old selves they had once been. He, once the untouchable millionaire, became a father not by blood, but by endurance, by love that cost him everything yet gave him more than he had imagined. She, once the orphan defined by absence, became a daughter not by birth but by belonging, by trust that demanded more courage than any battle. Together, they stood at the edge of the unknown, scarred yet unbroken, transformed not into something perfect, but into something true. The world outside still judged, still resisted, but inside their walls a family had been forged, and no decree could erase it. The final hearing arrived on a day washed clean by rain, as though the heavens themselves had chosen to prepare the stage for an ending. The courtroom, familiar now, no longer intimidated him in the way it once had, though the stakes had never been higher. She sat beside him, her small hand resting in his, calmer than the child he had first brought into this place, yet still carrying the shadows of her past. The judge entered, papers stacked like mountains of fate, and the murmur of voices hushed. His relatives were there again, stern and self-assured, convinced that tradition and bloodline would triumph over choice and persistence. The air was heavy with the weight of history, as though centuries of inherited power demanded obedience. Yet when the proceedings began, it became clear that this day would not follow the script his adversaries had written. Evidence was presented, not only of his stability, but of their life together. Records of her progress at school, testimonies from teachers who had witnessed her resilience, even drawings she had made, included in the file as proof of her growing sense of belonging. For the first time, the case was not about money or power, but about the undeniable truth of love expressed in daily endurance. His relatives argued, their words laced with venom, but the weight of evidence pressed back against them. And when the judge finally spoke, her words were measured, deliberate, final. Custody was granted, irrevocable, and the gavel fell like thunder, sealing the truth. He turned to the girl, tears unshed burning his eyes, and saw in hers the first unguarded smile, fragile yet radiant, the smile of a child who had finally been told she would not be taken away. Their return home was not triumphant in the manner of victory parades or grand celebrations, but in the quiet way life itself changes after a storm. The house, once a mausoleum of silence, now pulsed with a rhythm that could not be mistaken for anything but family. She ran through the halls without hesitation, her laughter echoing against marble and wood, transforming wealth into warmth. He watched her, his chest tightening with a mixture of joy and grief, for the victory had cost him much. His health, parts of his empire, friendships eroded under the weight of scandal. Yet as he stood in the doorway, watching her place flowers into a vase she had insisted on arranging herself, he realized that none of what he had lost mattered compared to what he had gained. He had been a man defined by absence, of heirs, of intimacy, of trust. But now, through endurance and persistence, he was defined by presence. She belonged, And so did he, not in the eyes of society alone, but in the truth they lived each day. It was not a restoration of what he once dreamed, but the creation of something entirely new. And it was this newness that filled him with awe. He no longer felt the hollowness of sterility, but the fullness of fatherhood. A fatherhood forged not in biology, but in relentless choice. The reconciliation with the world came slowly, reluctantly, but it came nonetheless. Newspapers that had once mocked him began to shift their tone, publishing stories of redemption, of the man who had defied tradition to embrace an orphan as his own. Society, fickle in its judgments, began to admire what it could not destroy, turning whispers of scandal into murmurs of respect. Some relatives, their bitterness exhausted, withdrew into silence, while others softened, unable to deny the truth of what had been built. But none of this mattered to him as much as the reconciliation within himself. For years he had lived haunted by failure, by the label of infertility that had seemed to strip him of worth. Now watching her grow, hearing her call him father, he realized that he had not been barren of legacy. He had only been barren of courage. She had given him that courage, not by demanding but by simply remaining, by trusting him enough to let him stay. In her resilience, he found forgiveness for himself, and in his persistence, she found a family that no decree could ever erase. Their reconciliation was not with bloodlines or inheritance, but with the truth that love is larger than lineage, that belonging is chosen, and that family is built, not given. The symbolic gesture that sealed their bond came not in court or through documents, but in the garden one spring morning. She asked him if they could plant a tree together, something that would grow as they grew, roots intertwining with their lives. He agreed, and together they dug into the earth, their hands dirty, their bodies bent close. They placed the small sapling into the ground, covering its fragile roots with soil, and he felt a weight lift from him as though he were burying every ghost of the past along with it. She watered it carefully, her face solemn, as though she understood the gravity of what they were doing. When it was done, they stood side by side, watching the small tree tremble in the breeze, its future uncertain, yet undeniable. "It will grow," she whispered. And he nodded, placing his hand on her shoulder. In that moment he understood that their destiny had changed forever, not because of rulings or victories, but because they had chosen to create something that would outlive them both. The tree became their covenant, silent but unbreakable, a living testimony to the truth they had fought to claim. And so their story closed not with the end of conflict, but with the beginning of renewal. They lived no longer as a man and a girl bound by circumstance, but as father and daughter bound by choice. Their house, once hollow, now echoed with laughter and arguments, with silences that carried comfort instead of fear. Their lives, once defined by loss, now pulsed with the promise of new beginnings. He no longer feared legacy, for he saw it daily in the way she grew, in the way she faced the world with courage she had once thought impossible. She no longer feared abandonment, for she saw it daily in the way he returned, again and again, never leaving, never faltering. Together they had rewritten destiny, not into perfection but into truth, scarred yet whole, fragile yet enduring. And though the world might still doubt, still whisper, they no longer lived for its approval. They lived for each other, for the tree growing in their garden, for the love that had been born not from blood, but from the relentless refusal to let go. Their destiny, once broken, had been changed forever, and in that change lay a beginning that would echo long after both their names had faded. The first lesson that emerges from this story, towering above all others, is that family is not bound by blood but by choice, and choice is a discipline that requires persistence rather than impulse. In a world that measures worth through lineage, inheritance, and the unbroken chains of ancestry, the millionaire and the orphan shattered an illusion that had stood for centuries. He had believed, as so many do, that infertility was a tombstone, a final sentence that declared his life incapable of passing anything forward. She had believed, as so many abandoned children do, that love was a fleeting accident, that presence was always temporary, and that promises existed only to be broken. Yet together they learned that the act of remaining, of choosing each other every day despite doubt and fear, was more powerful than any genetic bond. This is the kind of lesson that societies often resist, for it dismantles hierarchies built on exclusion. Yet it is the lesson most necessary for human survival, that belonging is not inherited, it is built. And in their building, through nights of fear and mornings of resilience, they offered a mirror to the reader, asking without speaking, "Who have you chosen to remain for, and who has remained for you?" The second lesson lies in the persistence of love as a force not of comfort, but of endurance. Too often, love is spoken of in easy tones, reduced to moments of warmth and fleeting joys. But here it revealed itself in its truest form, as labor, as patience, as sacrifice that carries no guarantees. The man endured scorn, the erosion of his health, the collapse of alliances he had built over decades, and still he rose each day not for profit or pride, but to remain present for the child who had entrusted him with fragile hope. The girl endured whispers, the sting of cruelty from her peers, the constant fear that even this man would vanish, and still she dared to extend her trust, one hesitant gesture at a time. Their endurance was not glamorous, it was often bitter, filled with exhaustion and doubt. But it was endurance nonetheless, and in endurance, love revealed its true face. This is a lesson that extends far beyond their story, into the lives of all who struggle in relationships, in parenthood, in communities. Love is not the absence of hardship, but the decision to persist within it, to continue despite the weight, to choose again and again, until the choice itself becomes unbreakable. A third lesson rises from the ashes of their pain. Healing is never the erasure of wounds, but the transformation of scars into maps that guide us forward. He could not erase his infertility, nor undo the years of coldness and solitude it had inflicted on him. She could not erase the nights of hunger, the betrayals of adults who abandoned her, nor the shame of being treated as disposable. But together, they learned that scars do not forbid joy. They demand it. His infertility became not a death sentence but a doorway into a deeper form of fatherhood, one unbound by genes but strengthened by daily choice. Her abandonment became not the end of trust, but the foundation for resilience, teaching her to recognize true permanence when it appeared. This is perhaps the hardest lesson to accept, for all human beings carry scars and long secretly for them to vanish. Yet the truth is that wholeness does not come from forgetting what hurt us, but from daring to build a life that acknowledges those wounds and still thrives. Their story reflects this truth like a mirror held to the reader's own life. Your pain does not define your worth, but what you create, despite it, does. The final lesson, drawn not only from their endurance but from their renewal, is that legacy is not measured by wealth or bloodline, but by the lives we change through presence. For so long, the man had believed his empire would be his monument, that his name engraved on buildings and contracts would outlast him. Yet as his health faltered, as scandals chipped away at his reputation, he discovered that no empire, no inheritance, no fortune could outlive the silence of an empty house. It was in the drawings she left on his desk, in the tree they planted in their garden, in the sound of her laughter echoing through halls once hollow, that he found his true legacy. She, in turn, discovered that legacy was not only what one receives, but what one dares to give. By trusting him, by allowing herself to belong, she gave him a future more powerful than any dynasty could. This lesson challenges the reader too. What are you building that will outlive you? Not in the fragile permanence of stone or money, but in the laughter, the love, the endurance that you give to those who depend on you. For in the end, the greatest inheritance is not blood but presence, not wealth but the courage to remain.